Scott Henderson, good to see you again. It's been a while.
Yes, nice to have a chat with you.
Yeah, I've been meaning to connect with you for some time now. Things get in the way. But anyway, we've done it. We're here today. And so just for my readers, I just want to give a brief introduction to you because I know I did talk about your work in my book. And I briefly talked about your work in my second book. For those of you who don't know, Scott Henderson is absolutely amazing. The amount of research he's done in the last decade with the film record of the Apollo missions. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Scott, correct me on this, he downloaded the complete catalog.
I have absolutely every photograph of all of the images on the lunar surface and all of the images in the capsule on their translunar injection and return. I have all of those. I don't have all of the pre-flight and other interview photographs and stuff like that of the entire collection. But I have everything that's on the ground. Okay?
So you focused mainly on the photographic as opposed to the film record. Am I mistaken in that? Is that correct?
I have most of the videos down as well now.
Okay.
I've been looking at those because we use them in some of the videos, right?
Yeah.
But the anomalies that you find when you look through the photographic record is just unbelievable. You can take just about any photograph and find items on the ground that just should not be there. They're man-made objects. There's steel, metal parts, bolts, everything sticking out of the ground, pieces of mechanical equipment and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Pieces of rockets, pieces of everything. And of course, you're looking at where they were practicing doing the simulations at Flagstaff. You have an entire military dump site there. And I imagine that that's where they did the final simulation on that particular thing. I mean, if you realize that all of the locations that NASA had to work from, the large buildings that they did simulations in, and they had simulators for the command module and the LEM and everything else set up in various facilities, whether it was in Florida, Houston, California, and of course in Arizona. But the main ground photographs are all taken on a dump site, and Flagstaff has that dump site. It's still in operation today. I mean, they could have shot some of the other photographs where you don't see anything. They could have been taken in a different location, but not likely. Their main simulations, their training files and documents on there show the location where they were at when they were doing all of their practice. Farouk Albaz was their time management specialist. He laid out the cue cards, so what they did in the simulation for timing, because they're working on limited consumable supplies in their PLSS, he set out stations so that as they traveled one to the other, the timeline is all set down there. And then the rocks on their geological journeys where they were traveling to gather rocks up, they set those rocks down at those stations, and those are all listed in the cue cards.
Can you explain that, the cue cards, for the viewer? Because I don't think people fully understand that. I put some of the photos that you're talking about in my second book, the wrecking yard and some of the things you found there, because I found that fascinating.
The cue cards are worn on the wrist for their EVAs. And in there, the timeline starts at 0 when they first sat down on the thing. It's not part of the overall mission timeline. So the timeline on the cue card starts at 0 and goes on from there. When they were practicing, they were going from the LEM to each of the stations. If they got 5, 6, 7 stations that they were doing, while they were practicing, they inserted the time that it took to walk from one to the other, or if they're on the rover driving to it, the length of time they're staying there, the number of photographs they were going to take there, and included in the cue cards the angle to the sun that they were shooting the photographs at, and the camera settings are in there, all in the cue cards.
So it was scripted.
That's all fine for practice.
Mm-hmm.
But that would have nothing to do with being on the lunar surface, because they wouldn't know exactly the terrain that they're actually in, traveling from one place to another. Mm-hmm. And there is no way that they could map where they're going to stop. There might be certain crater edges or whatever that they might want to go to if they were actually on the lunar surface. Mm-hmm. But they wouldn't know how long it would take to get there. They wouldn't know the camera settings because you're not in an atmosphere, so now you have the light is completely unfiltered from the sun. There's no way that you could color correct a camera on the surface here and allow for it to be on the lunar surface.
What came to my mind when you mentioned that was, why would there be even camera settings mentioned on a cue card if you can't adjust the camera while you're in that environment on a lunar surface?
That's right, exactly. But you see, the point is that the cue cards were to practice with. Those timelines on the lunar surface, they wouldn't be accurate.
Exactly.
The camera settings wouldn't be accurate.
But they were using this, supposedly they were using the cue cards while they were supposedly on the lunar surface. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, yeah.
And then you have the next anomaly, which is the fact that in the cue cards, they're giving descriptions of the rocks that they were going to find on the lunar surface. Mm-hmm. And these were set out from geological surveys that they did before, gathering rocks up, and they set them down in the ones on the Earth. But those aren't going to be necessarily mean the same rocks that they're going to find on the lunar surface.
Or in the same position.
Right? But in the cue cards, it very explicitly describes the mineral contents within a rock after they split it open. Well, you can't have it in there, and that's printed. It's not like they're writing in the cue cards as they're going along.
Yeah.
These are printed in, and they were done up months ahead or even years ahead while they were practicing. It shows the fakery. It shows how it was developed, and they simply went through a full-dressed simulation on Earth to do all of the filming to be on the moon. And of course, they also claim that, well, we did this just in case we didn't get any video back or anything back from the lunar surface, but we actually went. I've heard that excuse and everything else, right? But when you see that, just in that alone, then you realize that the photographs are also taken during those simulations. And when you see the different lighting and you can see the difference in the photographs if you look at the ones specifically around the LEM and around the flag when they first set everything up. Those photographs are so well focused, so color corrected, so everything else. Those are done by professional photographers. The rest of the photographs, when they're out messing around at the different stations and they're shooting into the sun and everything else, yeah, that's just the astronauts. Like, there were amateur photographers that got trained on them, but that other collection, what they needed for media purpose was maybe 3 or 4 dozen photographs to put in magazines and everything else to do it. I don't think they ever intended to have all of the other photographs. And I don't even think that NASA kept them, because when you look through the documents on the training of the astronauts on the cameras, the astronauts themselves developed their own films, their own magazine films. Not NASA didn't even keep them in their training. So they developed them and kept them themselves. And of course, they didn't show up until 30 years later. For the 30th anniversary, all of a sudden, oh, now we have internet access, now we can put all the photographs up.
So the astronauts themselves were holding on to those photos?
They're training photographs.
The training photographs, okay. See, that's what I was getting at. Like, where is this chain of command? I mean, in a mission of this magnitude, you would expect a chain of command of, just like a trial, a chain of command of evidence, you would expect a chain of command of all the evidence that they had picked up while on the lunar surface. There doesn't seem to be a chain of command here.
That's what they claim for the practice.
Yeah.
Right? But that's where these magazines are coming from. That's why the original films are all destroyed by NASA and everything else. But on the 30th anniversary, when you had internet access, and they put the journal site up, I think the 95 or something like that, they finished it around 97. Kip T scanned all of the photographs in to put up on the internet.
Yep.
I think the astronauts were hanging on to these film canisters, their magazines, and that's where they came from.
And the other thing you found out too, and this is something I'd like you to talk about, I actually want to get to something Marcus mentioned about the actual Hasselblad cameras that they were supposedly using on the surface. I'll get to that in a second. But when you had found anomalies in the photographic record, you or anyone else for that matter, that you've noticed that NASA had updated those photos and had either airbrushed out those anomalies or had done something to update the photos recently. I remember you saying something about that.
They've made corrections in a number of photographs. Okay, the sea rock, they just made that disappear. But they've done other stuff around the base of the LEM. They're on the journal site. That one photograph they've corrected and another one they haven't.
Mm-hmm.
They've simply removed items off of it that should be clearly visible. They saw it in one, or somebody brought it up, or maybe I brought it up and mentioned it, and then all of a sudden they've gone and done a correction on it, but they missed the other photographs where it's also being seen. I don't show everybody an anomaly in one photograph.
Yeah.
It could be in 4 or 5.
That's what people need to realize, is that NASA is watching. They're watching what we're doing. They're
Absolutely.
watching what researchers like you are doing, and they're updating the photos accordingly. But you have the originals.
Absolutely. When I see them do stuff, they have put an overlay over top of them so that you can't zoom in anymore. It just kind of fuzzes.
Yeah.
They've done that on March to the Moon. They put like a gray matting over everything, and they tried to show that it was off the original film. That's all just dropped in. All of the outside edges, they just dropped that in for fun and games. I don't know. They didn't pull those things out of the freezer and rescan them again. Because if they did, they'd be a much higher quality.
Yeah.
What's on March to the Moon is basically the same quality that you see on the journal site. Okay, it's the same photograph, except it has an overlay over it, where it can black it right out. You can't see into anything, and it's got like a Photoshop grain effect to it.
Yeah, and I know there was one photo that actually comes to mind, and I'm sure you've done a lot of work on this. There was a photo, the famous photo of Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon. It was actually on the front cover of National Geographic, if I'm not mistaken. And what was interesting about that photo is, and you can speak more to this, I just want to make a few points because this is so interesting. The background lighting seems to fall off at a distance, and that would be virtually impossible given the fact that the lunar surface with no atmosphere and its proximity to the sun would be illuminated evenly across the surface. But here in the photo, you have a light dropping off, like fading off into black.
He's in a hot spot.
Yeah.
He's in an absolute hot spot. And if you look at Apollo 11, 12, and 14, that lighting anomaly is there. The hot spot is there.
Yeah.
In those 3. And I think those were shot at nighttime just with lighting.
And that's the significance of what I'm trying to get across to everyone is that when you see photos of the actual lunar surface, it's very uniform. The lighting from the sun is the only source of light that it has. Of course, it's when they were on the moon, supposedly on the moon, that it's the only source of lighting they had was the sun. They couldn't bring their own lighting equipment, but yet here you have the sun in the Apollo photos, the lighting rather in the Apollo photos, dropping off when it should actually be uniform across. And I just want to make sure people understand that, because you don't have to be a photographer to understand, a photography expert to understand the significance of that point alone.
If you take a look at Apollo 12, and you can just see the fall off in the photographs, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Right across every one, and you can see where they're focusing the attention on a particular object on the lunar surface or an astronaut or whatever. That's where the hot spot is, and they're quite visible.
And explain the hot spot to people who are not familiar with that terminology.
Well, it's like walking out at nighttime and shining a flashlight. The hot spot is the center of the lighting, and then as it fades off to the side.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're seeing in these photographs, is the center, the focal center of it. Of course, if it was the sun, then it's going to be even. Well, like when it comes down to it, I just show them the wet flag.
Yeah, talk about that, Scott. That's a good story.
I mean, they can sit there. I mean, all of a sudden there's water on the moon, like
the wet flag on the moon. Scott is talking about. Scott, talk specifically about that. That's a very interesting story.
Well, Apollo 17, the flag. There are 2 or 3 images where you can see that the flag is wet, and one of them, of course, is one they used. It's fairly iconic. It's been everywhere. It has billions of views and everything else. And it's with Jack Smith with the Earth just above the top of the flag. And it's a nice close-up of it. And the flag is absolutely soaking wet. And when you look around the set on Apollo 17, you'll see that the LEM is wet, everything is wet, the ground is dark, it's a gray-blue kind of color on it, it's very dark. So the set design behind it, it doesn't match the mountains anymore. But if you look through the photographs, of course, the weather gets a little nicer and then the ground starts to dry up, and then the ground is now matching the background. Right? It starts to match again. Like if you're on the lunar surface, it shouldn't change, right? But when it gets wet, dirt gets darker in color, right? And of course, the footprints are quite defined in there because the moisture that's in the dirt really puts it in. And when they get out and they're traveling around, by the time you get on the 30 EVA, right, it's kind of loose, sandy soil. And I will call it soil. They call it regolith. Regolith is just a term, by the way, or loose dirt on any surface on any planet, included Earth.
Yeah.
Right? So we got regolith outside your front door, right?
That's just a fancy name.
From Earth. So soil is soil, so that's what we can call it soil. We don't have to be NASA fans and say it's regolith, right? But that is the main type of thing we're talking about, the difference in Apollo 17, where the color of the soil changes because of the moisture content, because it obviously rained, and the wet flag in Apollo 17 is there, and there's nothing NASA can do about that. They can't just adjust that photograph because that's in hardback books, it's in magazine, it's in the original magazines, it's a very famous photograph on there. I mean, it's even up on their museum walls. You imagine a 12 by 12, you imagine a guy coming up there and, you know, they put the picture up and the guy had to paint that in. You think he would have known that he was painting and it looks wet? If you are working for NASA and you believe that people landed on the moon, you can't see it. Nobody has seen it. And I'm amazed that I'm the only one that saw it. Right?
That's because you put the time in. But the point, too, is for the viewers is that moisture shouldn't really be on a lunar surface. It would evaporate. It would boil off immediately. You could not have a sustained wet flag on the lunar surface, and that's the point a lot of people should understand. There's no atmosphere. It's the vacuum of space.
You get above 40,000 feet, and there's no moisture, right?
Yeah.
That's why the clouds only go to that level. They will not exceed that.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the atmospheric pressure that's causing the evaporation.
Yeah.
Coming off there. When you get into a vacuum, at that kind of a hard vacuum, it would be instantaneous.
Yeah.
If you release anything in there. And of course, the outgassing or off-gassing, however term you wish to use, of any liquid, even if it's a lubricant, that's documented in the NASA files, right? No lubricants in the camera.
No lubricants in the camera, and I'm learning this myself for the first time in the last little while. It was a fascinating subject when it comes to outgassing of materials in the vacuum of space. A lot of people don't realize that you do lose some of the material because of the vacuum of space, especially with the work that you and Marcus and Robert have done with the performance of the film that they were using in the vacuum of space. And it was outgassing of the actual film. And that was a point that I wanted to come back to in terms of Marcus. We were talking about this, and this is very important. When we talk about the fakery involved, Marcus was talking about the lunar photos that were taken by unmanned missions. I'm not specifically sure which one now, I don't recollect, but I think it was in mid-1960s anyway. It was before the actual Apollo missions. And he was watching a presentation of this done, and the person doing the presentation was talking about how the film inside the camera was pressurized. It would have to be pressurized in order to produce the film images that they were seeing, because there is no atmosphere outside of Earth's atmosphere, so film would not work properly, probably wouldn't work at all. But yet here we have the Apollo missions using the Hasselblad camera with no pressurization of its own inside. It was not encased in any pressurization, And just the film was used exposed to the vacuum of space. And as you have proved with your work,
And
along with
exposed to
Robert,
the temperature and exposed to the radiation.
exactly. You made a determination of what it would be like so high above the Earth's surface, but in terms of the hard vacuum on the lunar surface, these photos would not have turned out. It's definitely not as pristine as they have supposedly turned out. So that was some interesting work that the three of you have done.
Yeah. The one thing that people need to understand about that kind of plastic that is used in making film, like the actual plastic on that film, the Estar film, if you like. That's the exact same material as the Mylar. And the tests they did at the Glenn Research Center showed that a vacuum of 10 to the minus 6 actually off-gases that material. It shrinks back, cracks, and just disperses. Right?
And 10
That's
to the
the actual
minus 6
plastic
represents
itself.
what altitude? I want the readers to be clear on this.
130 miles.
Yeah, above the Earth's surface. That's 10 to the minus 6, folks. Now talk about that, compare that to the lunar surface.
Go to the ISS, which is said to be at 10 to the minus 7, at 250 miles, right? And that's a factor of 10. What people don't understand when they're talking about it, and what they argue about, is they always revert back to air pressure. The force of air pressure, of course, it drops down, right?
Yep.
So they're looking at PSI. Oh, and it drops down to nothing. And then you have other people that say that even at a full vacuum is only equal to 1 atmosphere. And that is not correct. The torr value is measuring the force of the vacuum. And that's the only scale that you can use. All the rest of them, the mercury scale, everything else, is measuring the residual, what's left of an atmosphere.
And torr, by the way, is the name of a physicist that they had named this.
Yes, Marcus covers totally. But
I've
read all of the stuff. He, created the barometer and things like that. But the force of the vacuum. Okay, when you get down and you get into 0.0001% atmosphere, it becomes meaningless, right? But the torr scale keeps on going by a factor of 10. You get out to a 10 to the minus 12 when you get to the moon. And what they claim it's between 11 and 12. On the sunny side, it's minus 11. On the dark side, it's minus 12. Okay? On the back side of the moon, it's minus 12. Right? And it's no big deal because we can't handle that force. We can't build a machine with strong enough walls to handle the force of the vacuum. And for a prime example, when they say it's equal to 1 atmosphere, that's all the force of the vacuum is. If you take a spacesuit, and their spacesuits were at 3 3/4 psi, that's what they're down to. The amount of oxygen the body can absorb is debilitated to the point where you are conscious, but you wouldn't have any energy to do anything. Your body cannot exchange. It needs to have the differential, like when you're breathing now. You have to have that differential in the air pressure to be able to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen in the lung. And when you drop the pressure down outside, the body can't absorb that.
That's why you have to increase the oxygen levels if you do that.
Even if you have 100%, your body is not efficiently exchanging that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even when you're breathing 100%.
You can get some, but it won't last long.
You get some.
Yeah.
You get down, you're on Mount Everest, you're down at 5 psi, that's okay. When you get down to like 3 3/4, it's enough to keep you alive. But anyway, they claimed that they were capable of doing that and running around and hopping and jumping like you see them do. Right? And they're not out of breath, and they're not tired, they're not anything. That's the one thing about the lack of pressure in there. But if the vacuum of space is only equal to 1 full atmosphere, take another 14.7 psi and apply that to the suit. Take a suit and pressurize it then to 18 psi. Well, that's enough to hold your car tire up and drive around on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A basketball is around 8 psi. See how hard you can squeeze it in. That's how hard your gloves are going to be. Now bring it to 18 psi and see if it just doesn't blow up. How thick does that have to be to handle that? Right?
That's interesting because I know Ralph Rene, I think he did an experiment on that too, demonstrated.
Yeah, 3
the
psi,
glove.
3 psi, and he couldn't close his fingers.
Yeah. I mean, we can go on forever about the details, and they're fascinating. And if people would just take the time to look at the details, and as you just mentioned now, as you a very good example, you just put it all together when people say, well, what about this, and this? Well, if this, and this doesn't work, none of that is going to work, right? So you don't have to look at every detail. You have to look only at a few details of the Apollo missions, and if you can knock out a few of those details and disprove them,
you wouldn't be able to bend your knees, arms, anything.
Yeah.
Right? But they just say, oh, well, it's 3 psi. Well, that's inside. Then you have to take the force on the outside, and they ignore that. NASA ignores the force of the vacuum.
Yeah.
And to give you an example, we're not even talking into a real vacuum. We're just talking about the little vacuum chamber that Robert bought to do it. It goes to 10 to the minus 3, which is nothing. That's enough to boil some water and stuff like that. You put a pop can in there. Pop cans are rated at 90 psi. And that's because they're carbonated, they're under pressure. Right? So when you open a can of pop, it's got 5 or 6 psi in it because it's cooled down to 3 degrees. But it also sits out in the sun and it won't blow up. Right? So it might be at 30 or 40 psi sitting in the sun. But if there's only a differential of 1 atmosphere, which is 14.7 psi, you put a pop can in there, and let's say it's got 20 psi in it. Room temperature, at 20 psi. If there's only a differential of 14.7, then it's 35 psi when you put it in the vacuum chamber. And it's rated at 90, and yet you can blow it up with a very small one. Imagine if you pulled it to 10 to the minus 5 or 6, or let's get to minus 12, which we can't even do. And that's the other thing. We cannot reproduce the vacuum of space because of the force.
Right.
The Glenn Research Center, the walls have 8 feet of reinforced concrete and another 2 feet of aluminum, steel, and titanium. And that only goes down to 10 to the minus 6 at 130 miles up.
Okay, back up for a second there. During the training for the Apollo missions, they had those vacuum centers built back then. What were they able to get out of that?
The Glenn Research Center, they didn't do any training for the Apollo missions in there.
Okay.
They had a vacuum chamber for the command module that they put in there and a few other things, fuel tanks and stuff like that.
So you just said something very interesting. They didn't do any training at all. The astronauts did no training at all in their spacesuits in a vacuum environment. Is that correct?
The only testing that you will see is LeBlanc, and he was not in an Apollo spacesuit. He was in that blue so-called liner suit with the ribbing and all of the stuff on it.
And I've seen that video. That's the only one that exists.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
is there any documentation besides, if there's no video, is there any documentation at all for this?
the documentation that NASA has put up, and this is recently, this is within the last 10 years, because people were saying the suits weren't tested.
Yeah.
They came out and said, well, the suits were tested and certified at 200,000 feet.
200,000 feet, 40 miles above Earth. That's in the documents. I haven't seen that. That's fascinating. Okay, so what I want everybody to understand is that before, 10 years ago at least, there was absolutely no documentation, there's absolutely no video of any of the astronauts testing out the spacesuits or training along those lines in the vacuum chambers that they had built specifically to test how components or spacecraft would perform in the vacuum of space.
LeBlanc's suit failed at 70,000 feet.
70,000 feet. And that was not an Apollo spacesuit.
That was supposed to be the liner for the suit. The suits inside the museums today that you see for the Apollo
Yep.
are not spacesuits. Those are their practice suits.
Was that for the Apollo suits or for another space
You
suit?
see them showing videos of them putting a liner into one of the Apollo suits, right?
Yeah,
That blue unit.
yeah,
But the suits you see that are in the museums, the part that seals is where the bell helmet fits onto.
right.
That bubble helmet fits on there. That's where it seals. The blue suit you see LeBlanc wearing also has a helmet on it. Well, you can't have one sealing on and then have you can't wear two helmets and have both of them sealing, right? The one holding the pressure, you can't have your head can't be outside,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it has to seal on. So the part that seals on is attached to the outer suit, which is the white suit. And that's what you see in the museum, and they do not have an inner liner. They have a little foam comfort pad or whatever that goes in there. I think they use that foam pad to actually make it look like the suit was inflated.
So what we have here so far, we have Apollo spacesuits that were supposedly used very successfully in a vacuum of space, the hard vacuum of space on the lunar surface, with absolutely no testing in any vacuum chambers. The astronauts did not train in them. Well, they trained in them, or they were doing simulations, but they were not ever used inside the vacuum chamber, which can't even duplicate the conditions on a lunar surface. And now we have what you're talking about in terms of sealing, if I'm not mistaken.
What you see in the museum is the helmet going on, the bubble helmet that goes on inside and seals down. First of all, the seal is just a rubber seal, and of course that wouldn't work at 10 to the minus 11.
Right.
You go past 10 to the minus 6 and you got to use steel. One time only use steel things, and they just have little latches. So they're quick release latches. They're like the tongue on the door in any household, right?
Yeah.
That's all they do is they go in there and there's one button and they retract back.
Yeah.
For quick release, right? They do not compress down onto the seal. And then when you pressurize it inside, of course, the two surfaces are pushing away from the seal.
Yeah.
You have to design the seal so that the pressure is forcing the seal against the seal.